Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable. Let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever felt like someone is watching you, even when you're sure you're alone? That strange, unsettling feeling that creeps up your spine makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up? Well, I started noticing something like that every evening. It wasn't the usual feeling of being observed from behind or a glance in the corner of your eye. No, this was different. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world around me slowly sank into darkness, I'd glance out of my window and there, across the street, in the window of the neighboring house, I could see a figure. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. A flicker of movement here and there, shadows dancing in the dimming light. But as the days turned into weeks, the figure became clearer. Every evening, at exactly the same time, a person would appear at that window. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them, standing still, looking directly at me. I convinced myself that it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone in the house, perhaps a family member or a stranger staying there. But every time I'd look, there they were, unwavering, their presence almost oppressive. As if they were waiting for something. Or someone. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was a late Thursday evening when I decided to take a closer look. I had been pacing around my apartment, distracted by the figure in the window, when I finally made up my mind. I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door, determination fueling my every step. I crossed the street, heart racing, the evening air cool against my skin. The house stood there in front of me, silent, still. I had never paid much attention to it before, but now, standing so close, I could see that it was old. Very old. The paint on the front door was peeling, and the windows were cloudy with grime. It looked abandoned, even though I knew someone lived there. Or, at least, someone had been there. I approached the front steps and stopped, hesitating for a moment. The air seemed thicker here, colder. As I reached for the doorknob, a sharp, sudden sound cut through the stillness, the creak of wood. I pulled my hand away, startled. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I took a deep breath and knocked. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still, there was no answer. Feeling uneasy, I turned to look at the window, but the figure was gone. My heart skipped a beat. Had they seen me? Was I being watched right now? I tried the door once more. This time, the knob turned easily beneath my fingers. The door opened with a faint groan. A stale, musty scent filled the air, and I stepped inside. The house was dark. No lights, no sounds, just silence. The hallway stretched out before me, narrow and dim. Dust particles floated in the stagnant air, illuminated only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I took a few tentative steps inside, my breath shallow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding far too loud in the silence. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The floor creaked under my weight, and the further I went, the more the atmosphere grew heavy. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I reached the staircase, and for a moment, I hesitated. The figure in the window, Was it someone in this house? Were they waiting for me? My fingers curled around the railing, and I took the first step up. And then, a sudden sound, a soft shuffle, came from upstairs. I froze. It wasn't the creak of an old house settling, it was something else. Something purposeful. The sound grew louder, closer. Someone, or something, was up there. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, straining to hear. The air felt colder still, the silence so thick that even the slightest sound seemed amplified. I stood there, unable to breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure from the window had to be up there. They were waiting for me. I could feel it. Then, without warning, the light above me flickered, and the entire house seemed to shudder. The shuffle stopped, and the silence returned. I stood frozen, not daring to move. My body tensed, my ears straining to catch any hint of sound. The silence felt oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides. I should have left right then, just turned around and gone back home, but something in me, some twisted curiosity, urged me forward. I moved slowly up the stairs, the creaking of the old wood underfoot making my heart race faster. I had to know what was in this house, what had been in that window, watching me every night. What was waiting for me in the shadows? At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, dark in corners hiding who knew what. I instinctively turned to the right, where I knew the figure had been, where I had seen them standing so many times. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. I walked towards it, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath was shallow, my mind spinning with questions. Who lived here? Why had they been watching me? What was I about to find? I reached for the door, my hand trembling. As I pushed it open, a wave of cold air washed over me, sending a shiver down my spine. The room beyond was pitch black, but something inside seemed to draw me in, like an invisible force pulling me closer. I stepped into the room, feeling the weight of the darkness surrounding me. There was a faint smell, something stale and forgotten, lingering in the air. I reached for the light switch, but it felt brittle, like it might break if I applied too much pressure. My fingers brushed the switch, and the light flickered on. The room was empty, but not quite. There, in the far corner, a small desk sat, covered in dust. Papers were scattered across the surface, but the most striking thing was the mirror hanging on the wall above it. It wasn't the kind of mirror you'd expect to find in an abandoned house. No, this one was large, ornate, with intricate carvings around the edges. It had an unsettling quality to it, as if it didn't belong in this place at all. I couldn't help myself. I walked toward it, my gaze drawn to the glass. At first, there was nothing, just my reflection, looking pale and tired in the dim light. But then, something shifted. A figure appeared behind me, just out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the desk and the scattered papers. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, just out of sight in the reflection. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I stepped closer, eyes locked on the glass, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, tall and thin, stretching unnaturally across the room, its edges flickering like a flame. It seemed to shift, its form warping, as if it wasn't entirely solid. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to look away, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the reflection, unable to break free. The shadow grew, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. A face began to form within the darkness, a twisted, distorted face with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. I could feel its gaze on me, as if it were watching me from inside the mirror, and the sensation was worse than anything I had ever felt. It was as if it knew me. It knew everything about me. And then, without warning, the figure in the mirror grinned. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I turned to flee, but before I could move, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, panic surging through me. The room was suddenly even darker, the shadows pressing in from all sides. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hand scrambled for the knob, but it felt as if something was holding it from the other side. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my frantic breathing. And then, from the darkness behind me, I heard it. A voice, soft and low, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I whipped around, my eyes wide, searching the darkness for the source, but there was nothing. The room was still empty, except for the mirror. The reflection in the glass had changed. Now, there were two figures. The other one stood behind me, its shape barely discernible in the shadowy depths of the room. It was tall, just like the figure in the mirror. And it was getting closer. "Leave now," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Before it's too late." I reached for the door once more, my fingers slick with sweat, and with a desperate twist, I finally managed to yank it open. The light from the hallway flooded in, and the oppressive darkness of the room seemed to shrink away. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back outside, my chest heaving with fear. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real. Not anymore. I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, as they had always been. Silent. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. From the window. From the shadows. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But something told me that no matter how far I went, I'd never escape it. Because whatever was in that house, whatever was watching me, wasn't done with me yet. And I was already too far gone. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced, tangled in the images of what I had seen, of the figure in the mirror, and the voice that had whispered to me. I kept seeing that grin, twisted and unnatural, as if it was burned into my memory. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, staring at me from the shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it had been a trick of the light, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong with that house. Something was wrong with the whole street. The next morning, I decided to go back. I needed answers. I couldn't just let it go, not after what happened. The sun was barely up when I left my apartment, walking slowly towards the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the air thick with an early morning fog. As I approached the house, I could see that it looked the same as before, dilapidated, abandoned, but now with a different kind of heaviness about it. The windows seemed darker, as if they were hiding something inside. The front door was ajar, just a crack, as if inviting me in. I hesitated. I should have turned around. I should have walked away and never looked back. But my feet moved on their own, driven by some compulsion I couldn't explain. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly as I stepped inside. The familiar smell of dust and rot hit me like a wall. The silence in the house was oppressive, heavy, and it made my skin crawl. I made my way through the hallway again, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The door to the room where I had seen the mirror was still open, and as I entered, I felt the same chill wash over me. But this time, there was something different. The mirror was gone. I froze, staring at the empty space on the wall where it had once hung. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt wrong, as if it had shifted, like the very structure of the house had changed in the short time since I had last been there. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. I stepped forward, looking around. The desk was still there, papers scattered across its surface, but everything else felt distorted, out of place. I could hear a faint noise, something scraping against the floorboards, just out of sight. My heart thudded in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned, expecting to see something in the shadows, but there was nothing. No one. Yet, the noise persisted, growing louder. A slow, dragging sound. I stepped closer to the desk, scanning the papers. One of them caught my eye. Its edges were frayed, and it looked older than the others. As I reached for it, the scraping sound grew louder, now accompanied by a soft whisper, a voice I didn't recognize. Leave. I jerked my hand back, the paper crumpling in my grip. The room felt colder. I looked around, searching for the source of the voice, but the space was empty. Just the desk, the scattered papers, and the shadows that clung to the corners like they were alive. The whispering continued, growing more insistent. Leave now. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing. The door to the room had slammed shut, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I tried the door, but it was locked. Panic surged through me. I hammered my fist against the wood, shouting, "Let me out!" But my voice felt small, swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. The scraping sound was louder now, unmistakable. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. The noise moved closer, as if something was crawling just below the surface, dragging itself forward. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I was trapped. The house had me. The whispers were getting louder, clearer. You shouldn't have come back. I turned toward the wall where the mirror had once been, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, a shadow passing across the space where it had been. But it was gone before I could focus on it. And then, without warning, the door to the room opened, slowly, creaking as it moved. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted out of the room, through the hallway, and out the front door, not looking back. The house seemed to swallow me whole, the darkness lingering even after I stepped outside. The street was quiet, too quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the neighborhood, but it felt as if the light had no warmth. There was something wrong with this place, something that I couldn't understand. I walked quickly down the street, not daring to look up at the house behind me. I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. It was like the house itself was a living thing, feeding on my fear, drawing me back with each passing day. I didn't know what had happened to the mirror or why the house was so different, but one thing was clear. It wasn't over. The house was far from done with me. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every corner of my apartment felt too small, too suffocating. Even when I left for work, the streets seemed quieter, emptier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My thoughts constantly drifted back to that house. I tried to avoid it, telling myself I needed to forget, but the pull was relentless. Every evening, as dusk began to settle, I found myself walking back toward the neighborhood as if my feet had a mind of their own. I knew I shouldn't go near that house again, but I couldn't help it. There was something calling me, an invisible thread that tugged at my soul. I had to know what was happening, why the house felt so alive. One evening, as I neared the street, I saw it. The house stood there, as it always had, but something was different. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. It felt empty, as if it were waiting for me. The feeling of dread I had grown accustomed to had intensified, and yet I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this the right thing to do? Could I finally put this nightmare to rest? Or would I be swallowed whole by the darkness that lingered within those walls? I stepped forward, my body moving on autopilot, and before I knew it, I was standing at the doorstep again. The door creaked open as I pushed it gently, the familiar musty smell of decay hitting me like a wave. I hesitated for just a moment, then stepped inside, my footsteps barely audible on the dusty floor. The house seemed to welcome me with an eerie silence, as though it had been waiting for my return. I moved through the hallway, and this time I felt it. Something was wrong with the air. It was thicker, heavier. It clung to my skin like an invisible weight, pressing down on me with every step. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, stretching across the walls and flickering in the dim light. I found myself drawn back to the room, the one with the mirror. But when I entered, it was different again. The room felt larger, the walls stretching out, and yet there was no mirror. I stepped cautiously inside, my eyes scanning the room. The air was still, but I felt the presence of something watching me. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, beneath the floorboards, there was movement, subtle but unmistakable. The scraping sound again. Closer this time. I crouched down, my breath shallow, my mind racing. What was it? What was beneath the floor? The scraping intensified, almost like claws dragging against wood. My heart skipped a beat. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and lifted a loose floorboard. There, beneath it, was a small, narrow gap leading down into darkness. A cold draft swept up from the gap, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I stared into the black void beneath the floor. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft, low, and familiar. Leave. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the room, but it was empty. The voice came again, clearer now, more urgent. Leave, now. My pulse raced, and the weight in the room became unbearable. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows gathering, pressing in from every corner. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The floor beneath me creaked. Slowly at first, but then more insistently. Something was coming, and it was too close. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I backed away from the hole in the floor. The scraping grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was trying to crawl its way up to me. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding in the narrow hallway, the house groaning with each step. The door was open, the cool air from outside beckoning me, but it felt so far away. The darkness pressed in from every side, swallowing the light. I reached the door and flung it open, not daring to look back. I stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The house stood there, looming behind me, but it was different now. The darkness within it felt alive, pulsating, and it seemed to watch me from every window. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know what was real anymore. But one thing was clear, I was no longer just an observer. I had become a part of it. I turned and fled down the street, not stopping until I reached my apartment. I locked the door behind me, my heart still racing. But I knew I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. The house wasn't done with me. It never would be. I could feel it, its gaze, the pull of its darkness. It would come for me again. And next time, there would be no escape. The question wasn't whether I would survive, it was whether I would ever be able to leave. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows of the house lingered in my mind, creeping into my thoughts like a slow, persistent sickness. I could still feel the weight of the air in that room, hear the scraping beneath the floorboards. It had been real, I knew it had. The house was no ordinary place, and whatever it contained was not finished with me. The next day, I tried to carry on as if everything were normal. I went to work, met friends for coffee, and attempted to distract myself with trivial things. But there was a constant undercurrent of unease, a hum in my mind that wouldn't stop. The image of the house, the empty windows, the feeling of something watching me, followed me everywhere. I told myself I needed to stay away from it. But the compulsion was growing stronger. Every night, when the street lights flickered on and the world around me sank into twilight, I found myself walking back to that street, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I knew it was dangerous, that I should let it go, but something in me couldn't resist. The question still gnawed at me, what was in that house? What had I felt? What had I seen? Was it all in my head, or was there something more? My need for answers was becoming an obsession. One evening, unable to fight it any longer, I returned to the house. The street was unusually quiet, the air still and cold. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. As I reached the corner, I saw it again. The house stood there, silent and dark, the windows staring out at me like hollow eyes. But this time, there was no door creaking open. No invitation. I stood there for a long moment, hesitating. Something told me I should turn back, that I should leave before it was too late. But I couldn't. My feet moved without me, carrying me toward the front steps, up to the door that was ajar. The air felt even heavier than before, thick with dread. I pushed the door open. The familiar scent of decay hit me instantly, but this time it was different. The air was colder, and the silence was suffocating. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight, and I listened. No sounds. No footsteps. Nothing. Just the oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I hesitated at the doorway, my eyes scanning the familiar hallway. It was exactly as it had been the first time I had entered. But there was something else now, something out of place. The mirror in the hallway was back. It wasn't there before, and yet, now it stood at the end of the corridor, its surface dark and reflective, almost beckoning me. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. As I drew closer, I saw something strange. The reflection in the mirror didn't match my movements. It was slower, like a delayed echo. And in the mirror, behind me, was the figure, dressed in tattered clothes, its face hidden in shadow. I spun around. No one. There was no one behind me. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, watching me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the cold sweat on my skin sticking to my clothes. My breath hitched in my throat, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly terrified. It was real. The house was alive, and it knew me. A voice echoed through the room, low and guttural, the same voice from the night before. Leave, before it's too late. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its face becoming clearer, distorted, a twisted mockery of a person. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was hidden. And then, the scraping began again. This time, it was louder, more frantic. It wasn't just beneath the floor. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. I turned and fled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. The door was just ahead. I could make it. I could get out. But as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut, the sound deafening. I spun around, panic flooding my chest. The house was changing, shifting. The walls seemed to move, closing in on me. The room grew smaller, darker, and the scraping sound grew louder, almost deafening now. I was trapped. I turned back toward the mirror, my reflection still there, but now it was grinning at me, a wide, twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to it, locked in place. Too late, it whispered. You've seen too much. The world around me began to warp. The walls twisted, the floor buckled beneath me, and the house seemed to breathe, alive with an ancient, malevolent presence. I could feel it closing in, surrounding me, and I knew there was no escape. The house had claimed me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the face in the mirror, grinning wider, its eyes now fully visible, staring at me with a hunger that never stopped. And I understood then. It wasn't the house that was alive. It was me. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first heard it. The kind of warm, quiet afternoon where the world seems to slow down and the only sounds you can hear are the distant hum of bees and the rustling of leaves. I was out in the garden, doing some light repair work. A few broken bricks along the old path needed replacing, and the raised beds had to be tidied up for the coming spring. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, something unusual happened. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint murmur, like someone talking from far away. I stopped, listening intently, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be the wind or perhaps a neighbor's voice drifting over. The noise didn't seem to have a clear source. But then, it came again. A soft whisper. Low. Almost pleading. Help me, please. I froze. It was unmistakable now. The voice wasn't coming from the trees, nor was it carried by the wind. It was coming from beneath the ground. I took a cautious step back, my heart starting to pound in my chest. Was it my imagination? Perhaps a trick of the mind, an echo of the surrounding sounds playing games with me. But no, the voice was too distinct. Too clear. Please, help. The voice sounded more desperate now, as if it were calling out for someone, begging for assistance. I stood there, motionless, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was as though the earth itself was trying to speak to me. The sensation of unease washed over me, creeping into my bones. My mind raced, trying to figure out the cause of the sound. Was there someone trapped? Was there an animal beneath the soil, injured and calling for help? Against all logic, my curiosity won out. I knelt down beside the patch of earth where I had heard the voice. The ground felt unnaturally soft, as though it had been disturbed recently, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no open hole, no marks. The soil was undisturbed, just like the rest of the garden. But the voices persisted. Faint at first, then louder, clearer. "Help me, please." Something inside me stirred, a mix of concern and something darker, a growing sense of dread I couldn't shake off. I grabbed a spade and began to dig. With every scoop of earth that came away, the whispers grew stronger. The air seemed heavier, thick with tension, as if the garden itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I thought I was getting closer, something strange happened. A sharp, icy pain shot through my right arm. It felt as if someone had reached out from beneath the earth and grabbed me. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, my breath shallow. I glanced down at my arm, but there was nothing there, no marks, no bruises. Just the sensation of being gripped, as if invisible hands had clutched me from the other side. I stood there, shaken, unsure of what I had just experienced. My mind screamed at me to leave it, to stop digging, to walk away and never look back. But the voice, the desperate cries, still echoed in my head. "Help, please." And for some reason, I couldn't stop. I reached for the shovel again, despite the growing fear gnawing at me. Maybe it was because I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, needed me. Or maybe it was the dread of knowing I couldn't walk away, knowing that I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. With each shovelful of earth I removed, I began to feel like I wasn't alone anymore. There was something in the air, something shifting around me. The ground felt different now, darker. The whispers were no longer faint, they were insistent, loud, almost angry. And then, as I dug deeper, something grabbed my wrist. This time, it wasn't a gentle pull. It was a violent, relentless tug. I screamed, trying to pull my hand free, but it was as if the earth itself had decided to claim me. The force pulling me downward was too strong. It felt like being dragged into the very heart of the earth. Panic surged through me. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, giving way, as though something enormous and unseen was reaching up to take me. My vision blurred. I tried to scream again, but no sound came. The world around me tilted, spinning out of control. And then, I felt something cold brush against my skin, a touch that sent an icy shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the ground that was calling to me. Something was beneath it. And it was coming for me. I fought to free myself from whatever was dragging me, my fingers desperately clutching at the soil, trying to anchor myself to something, anything. My heart hammered in my chest, the rapid beats almost drowning out the frantic whispering that now filled the air, louder and more insistent than ever. "Help, please." The voice was so close now, it was as though it was coming from inside my own head. The pull on my wrist tightened, pulling me downward with terrifying strength. I could feel the dirt and roots scraping against my skin as I struggled, my legs flailing helplessly, my feet slipping in the loose earth. Every part of me screamed to let go, to stop fighting, but I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could sense something in the depths below, something ancient and dark, moving, shifting beneath the surface. I glanced down, but the ground was too deep now, the darkness consuming all light. I could only see the vague shape of my own arm, the dirt rising around me like a cold, suffocating wave. The more I fought, the tighter the grip on my wrist became, until I felt the bones of my arm starting to crack under the pressure. Pain surged through my body, but I couldn't let go. I had to survive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pull stopped. I lay there in the darkness, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. My wrist ached, but the force had vanished. I pulled my hand free from the earth, trembling with the aftermath of that otherworldly grip. But something was wrong. The air around me was thick, oppressive. The sounds, once distant and faint, were now all around me. Whispers. Soft, broken, like many voices speaking at once, too low to understand but somehow impossibly close. I could feel their presence. They were near, surrounding me, pressing in from every side. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It was something much older, something that belonged to the depths of the earth. I turned my head, straining to see through the darkness. The shadows around me seemed to move, to shift, like they were alive, responding to the sound. I could feel the earth beneath me vibrating, a deep hum that seemed to echo from the core of the planet itself. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then, the ground beneath me trembled again, more violently this time, and I was thrown forward, my hands landing on something cold and wet. I froze. It wasn't soil anymore. It wasn't even stone. It felt like flesh. A low, guttural voice rumbled from the depths, a sound like the groaning of ancient wood, twisted and bent beyond recognition. Leave, now, leave while you still can. The words were not spoken, but felt, as though they were part of the very air around me, vibrating through my skin. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. The whispering had stopped. The growl had stopped. And then, silence. Complete, terrifying silence. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the earth itself was holding me down, keeping me from escaping. The air around me grew colder, the weight of it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. And then, a figure appeared in the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, something shifting against the blackness, moving in a way that didn't make sense. Slowly, it grew more distinct, more defined. A shape. A figure. A woman, or at least, something that resembled a woman. Her features were blurred, but her presence was undeniable. She stood before me, her form wavering like smoke, her long, tangled hair swirling in the cold air. She spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, from places I couldn't even begin to comprehend. You should not have come. Her words were not a warning. They were a judgment. And before I could react, her hand reached out, long, skeletal fingers brushing against my face, sending a wave of cold through me. I wanted to pull away, to scream, but I couldn't. Her touch was numbing, paralyzing, as though she had claimed my very soul. The whispering returned, louder than before, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. Leave, leave now, or be taken. I felt the ground shift beneath me again, and this time there was no escape. The earth opened up, a massive crack splitting the soil, and I was dragged down, deeper into the darkness, into the cold embrace of the earth that seemed to come alive with hunger. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the woman's voice, a final warning that echoed through the blackness. Don't dig, it's too late now. And then, silence once more. I awoke to darkness. Thick, suffocating darkness that pressed on every side, making it impossible to tell where the earth ended and the air began. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as though I were trapped in a thick, sticky substance. My limbs were slow to respond, and for a moment I thought I might be buried alive, that I had somehow slipped into the very depths of the earth. Panic surged through me, but my breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, the air thick with an oppressive cold that numbed my senses. I reached out with trembling hands, my fingers scraping against something rough, rock, or perhaps some ancient, decayed material. The texture beneath my touch felt wrong, as if it had been there for centuries, untouched by the world above. I tried to call out, but no sound left my lips. The silence was absolute, crushing. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the weight of it, as though the very concept of sound had been erased from this place. The memory of the woman, the figure I had seen, the cold touch that had paralyzed me, flooded my mind. "Don't dig, it's too late now," her words repeated in my head, a haunting refrain that gnawed at my sanity. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered, like a lingering shadow. With a surge of desperation, I pulled myself forward, pushing through the oppressive darkness, my hand brushing against jagged stones and uneven surfaces. The walls around me seemed to close in, pressing tighter as I moved. Each step felt like I was descending deeper into some unimaginable abyss. Then I felt it. A shift. A tremor. The ground beneath me rumbled again, but this time it wasn't just the earth that moved. The very air felt alive, as if something was stirring beneath the surface, something enormous, something ancient. The vibrations reverberated through my body, and I froze. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been calling to me, whatever had been pulling me deeper, was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real. The whispers returned, this time, no longer faint but clear and unmistakable. "You should not have come. It was never meant for you." The voice was not human. It was something far older, an entity that had existed long before any of us had walked the earth. It was a presence, a force that had waited, slumbering beneath the ground, for untold ages. And now, it was awake. I stumbled forward, my mind a blur of terror and confusion. I had to get out. I had to escape. But every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the earth, deeper into whatever nightmare lay beneath. The darkness was no longer empty. I could feel it. Something was moving just beyond the edge of my vision, shifting in the corners of my perception, just out of reach. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I could hear it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, moving closer. Someone, or something, was following me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in desperate gasps. But the darkness was still. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. Is it in my mind? I thought, my mind unraveling, questioning what was real and what was just the terror playing tricks on me. But then, I heard it again. A low growl. Deep and guttural, like something enormous, something ancient, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to rise. And then the earth moved again, this time with a force that made me stumble backward. I grabbed at the walls, trying to steady myself, but the ground beneath me cracked open, and I was thrown forward, tumbling down into the abyss below. I landed with a sickening thud, the wind knocked out of me. Pain shot through my body, but I could barely focus on it. My senses were consumed by the terrifying silence that followed the fall, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, a voice. It wasn't the same voice I had heard before. This one was older, deeper, filled with an authority that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "You have awakened us. Now you will join us." I turned, my heart leaping in my chest, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The darkness around me seemed to part, revealing shapes, figures, standing in the distance, tall, shadowy forms, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, as though the very air had frozen around me. The whispers, the growls, the voices, they all converged into a single, deafening roar in my mind, drowning out everything else. You should not have come. The figures moved closer, their presence now overwhelming, suffocating. The ground beneath me felt alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. I knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. I had dug too deep. I had awakened something that had been lying dormant for centuries, and now it would claim me as its own. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the glowing eyes of the figures, staring down at me with an eerie, knowing gaze. And then, there was nothing. Only the whispers. Always the whispers. The world was silent again, but not the same silence I had known before. This silence was suffocating, alive with an oppressive weight, as though it was consuming everything around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped, and I was trapped in a space where nothing could exist. No light, no sound, no escape. And then, the whispers returned. At first, they were soft, like a distant hum, barely noticeable. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded me completely. Their voices didn't come from any one place. They were everywhere, inside my mind, in the air, in the ground beneath me. It was a maddening cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, some pleading, some warning, others laughing in twisted joy. You have awakened us. The voice that spoke was not like the others. It was deep, ancient, filled with an unearthly power that made the very air crackle with energy. It wasn't a voice I could comprehend fully, but I could feel its weight pressing down on me. It wasn't just talking to me, it was talking through me, filling every corner of my mind, making my thoughts swirl in a frenzy of fear and confusion. You should have left when you had the chance. I tried to scream, to shout, to do anything to break free from this nightmare, but no sound escaped my lips. I could feel the air around me vibrating, as though the walls of this place were alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The ground beneath me seemed to shift again, undulating like it was breathing, like it was alive and waiting for something. The darkness around me deepened, becoming even more oppressive, and I realized I wasn't alone. The figures I had seen before were closer now, their glowing eyes piercing through the inky blackness, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Their shapes were no longer vague shadows. They had form now, tall, unnaturally thin beings, their limbs long and twisted, their faces obscured by hoods of darkness. They didn't walk. They glided, floating through the air like shadows on the wind, their presence a constant weight pressing down on me. You will not escape. Their voices echoed in my head, but their mouths didn't move. I could feel them, though, feel them getting closer, circling me like vultures, their gaze heavy and unblinking. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, by the weight of the earth around me, by the overwhelming presence of whatever they were. And then, one of the figures reached out. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was cold, cruel, like ice on my skin. The touch of a thing that had been dead for centuries, yet still yearned for something from me. We were here before the world was born. The words reverberated through my mind, filling every thought with the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to understand. I could feel their fingers closing around my throat, squeezing tightly, cutting off my breath. The world spun, darkness closing in around me, and for a moment, I thought I was going to die. But just as quickly as the pressure began, it stopped. I gasped, sucking in air like I hadn't breathed in ages, and the grip on my throat loosened. I collapsed to the ground, choking, my heart racing as I tried to regain control over my panicked breathing. The figures had stopped, but their presence was still there, watching, waiting. They were patient. Too patient. "You will join us." The voice came again, not from one figure, but from all of them, their voices blending together in a terrible symphony of power. I could feel the pull of their words, the weight of their intent. It was as if they were trying to bind me to them, to draw me deeper into this endless pit where nothing existed but them and the whispers. I had no strength left to fight them. Every part of me wanted to give in, to surrender to whatever fate they had planned for me. But something, some flicker of defiance, of survival, stirred inside me. I couldn't let go. I couldn't become one of them. Not like this. I pushed myself up, shaking with exhaustion and fear, and I tried to focus. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way to escape. In the depths of my mind, I remembered the moment before I had descended into this place. The voice, the figure that had warned me. The woman. She had told me to stop. She had told me it was too late. But maybe it wasn't too late. I took a deep, shuddering breath, steeling myself against the crushing weight of the darkness and the whispers that clawed at my mind. Slowly, carefully, I began to move. My body trembled, each step feeling heavier than the last, but I kept going. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how I would get out. But I had to try. The figures, sensing my movement, began to shift. They closed in on me, their glowing eyes flashing like pale stars in the blackness. "You cannot escape." Their voices were a chorus now, filling the air, the ground, the very space around me. Their reach was endless, and I felt them grasping at the edges of my thoughts, pulling me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then, something shifted in the air, a crack, a rupture in the fabric of the darkness. The earth trembled once more, but this time it wasn't the earth that was shaking. It was the very air around me, and I knew, in that moment, that I had triggered something. Something beyond these ancient beings, something even older than them. A tremor of hope flickered through me. I wasn't alone. The ground beneath me split, and a brilliant light pierced through the abyss. It was blinding, but it was also freeing. The light consumed everything, swallowing the figures, the whispers, the darkness. And for the first time since I had heard that first whisper from beneath the soil, I felt nothing. Silence. But this time, it was a different silence. One that wasn't filled with threat, but with relief. I had escaped. For now. The light was blinding, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I had just emerged from. It filled every corner of my vision, a dazzling, almost painful brilliance that seemed to stretch beyond any possible horizon. I squinted, shielding my eyes, but the light didn't fade. It wasn't natural, it was something else, something that felt wrong. I stumbled forward, still trying to process what had just happened. The figures, the voices, the oppressive weight of the earth beneath me, it all seemed impossible now, as though it had never truly existed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. What I had encountered was far older than anything I had ever known, and its influence had already begun to seep into me. The air felt different. It was thick with an unexplainable tension, as though the world itself had shifted, just a little, in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I stood in a place that was eerily familiar, my own garden. But the garden was no longer the same. The flowers, once vibrant and full of life, now appeared twisted, their colors drained, petals curled as if they had been scorched by something unseen. The ground beneath my feet still felt like it was alive, pulsing with a low, almost imperceptible hum. The sunlight above seemed distant, too bright, too harsh. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong to this place anymore. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, my body still shaking with the after effects of what I had endured. The weight of everything I had just witnessed pressed heavily on me. It felt like I had crossed some boundary, some line I could never return from. The figures in the darkness, the whispers in my mind, they were still there, lingering at the edge of my thoughts, never quite gone. I could still hear them, just faintly, their words echoing in my mind like a distant memory. You should not have come. The voice was clearer now, no longer an indistinct murmur, but a sharp, distinct command. It rang through my head, its resonance sending a chill through my bones. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't my imagination. The voice was real, and it was here, with me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing, no figures, no shadows, just the stillness of my garden. Yet the air was thick, charged, like a storm was about to break. The very earth beneath my feet seemed to breathe with a slow, rhythmic pulse. Please, no, I whispered to the air, to the earth, to whatever was listening. I've escaped. I'm out. I didn't mean to, but I knew it was useless. The moment I had broken through that darkness, the moment I had disturbed whatever was sleeping beneath, I had made a bargain. A deal that would cost me more than I could ever repay. The ground beneath me trembled again, and this time it wasn't subtle. It was a violent, shuddering quake that rattled my bones, sending shockwaves through my body. The earth cracked, splitting wide open, revealing the deep, cavernous pit beneath. But this time, there was no figure reaching up to pull me down. No shadows lingering at the edges of my vision. Instead, something else began to emerge, something far more sinister. From the crack in the earth, a dark, tendril-like substance began to creep upward, twisting and writhing like some enormous, otherworldly serpent. It pulsed with a life of its own, and as it moved, the air grew colder, darker, thicker. The once familiar garden now felt alien, as though it was becoming part of something far older, far more dangerous than I could comprehend. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a frenzy of frantic voices. You cannot escape. The earth claims you now. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. But with each step, the tendrils seemed to follow, advancing with terrifying speed, weaving and curling through the air, reaching for me. The ground beneath me shuddered again, and I felt someone, grabbing at my feet. Cold hands, grasping, pulling, trying to drag me back into the depths. You belong to us now. The words were clear now, unmistakable. I couldn't escape. In that moment, I realized something. The escape I had thought I had achieved was nothing more than a temporary reprieve. The earth had not released me. It had only let me go long enough to make sure I understood the price. It wasn't just my body that was claimed, it was my soul, my very essence. I had disturbed something ancient, something that had existed long before humanity walked the earth, and now it was coming for me. There was no running. No hiding. I turned, eyes wide with terror, but I couldn't outrun the pull of the earth, the weight of the darkness. The tendrils were everywhere now, wrapping around my legs, my arms, my body, dragging me down, down, down. And as the darkness closed in around me once more, I realized with a sickening certainty that the whispers would never leave. The earth had claimed me, and it would never let go. I still remember the first time it happened. It was a Thursday night, and I had just bought a new alarm clock. The old one had been acting up for weeks, and I was tired of waking up to it blaring randomly, even when I hadn't set it. So, I went out, bought a sleek, modern clock with all sorts of fancy features, digital readout, temperature gauge, even a built-in radio. I thought it would be the perfect solution. That night, I set it for 7 in the morning, hoping for a peaceful rest, free of the usual interruptions. I climbed into bed, the soft glow of the clock casting a warm, reassuring light in my bedroom. But as I closed my eyes, something felt off. A low, buzzing hum echoed faintly from the clock, but I shrugged it off as just the sound of electronics warming up. I fell asleep quickly, my body exhausted from a long day, and the next few hours passed without incident. Then, at exactly 3:33 in the morning, the alarm rang. It wasn't the typical buzz or beep I had set it to. This sound was different, sharp, almost desperate, like someone was trying to get my attention. The noise was so sudden, so unexpected, that it jolted me awake with a rush of adrenaline. I glanced over at the clock, my heart racing. The time read 3:33, just as the alarm had indicated. I hadn't set it for that time. I hadn't touched the settings since the first night I plugged it in. I stared at the clock, confused. Had I accidentally set it wrong? But no, everything was correct. I checked the time again, my eyes scanning it in the dim light. It still read 3:33. The buzzing persisted, filling the room with a low, insistent hum vibrating the walls. I reached over to turn it off, but as my hand touched the alarm, it stopped. The buzzing abruptly ceased, leaving me in an eerie silence. I sat up in bed, wide awake now, unsure of what had just happened. It was the kind of noise that didn't feel right, like it wasn't coming from the clock at all. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just a malfunction. But then I heard it. A soft sound, like something shifting in the dark. It wasn't coming from the clock anymore. The noise was faint but distinct, a slow, deliberate creak from somewhere in the room. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I waited a few moments, listening for any other sounds. The room was still, except for the occasional rustle from the air vents. I was alone. There was no reason to be frightened. But then the creaking started again. It was faint at first, like a floorboard groaning under the weight of someone walking. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could explain this sound, but all I saw was darkness. There was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I tried to shake it off. I was just tired. The clock had startled me, and now my mind was playing tricks on me. I told myself to go back to sleep. But then, I heard it again, this time much closer. A faint, shuffling noise, like something, or someone, moving just beyond my peripheral vision. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it. Someone was in my room. I slowly turned my head toward the source of the sound, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just the empty space of my room, the shadows shifting faintly in the low light. But the shuffling didn't stop. It continued, slow and deliberate, moving in a pattern I couldn't follow. It was as if someone, or something, was walking around me in a circle, waiting. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The atmosphere in the room had changed, like the air itself had thickened, become heavier. The sound of shuffling was now accompanied by something else, something even more disturbing. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the same direction as the shuffling, like a voice speaking from the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of my brain told me it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. But the more I listened, the more real it became. My heart raced as I slowly began to move out of bed. My feet hit the cold floor, and I cautiously stepped toward the direction of the sound. Every step seemed to echo in the silent room, amplifying my own fear. The whispering continued, low and distant, as if beckoning me closer. I reached the doorway of my bedroom, pausing for a moment to listen. The house was still, except for that soft, shuffling sound. I took another step forward, crossing the threshold into the hallway. And that's when I saw it. A figure. Just for a split second, there was a shadow, a dark, almost human shape standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. The figure was gone in an instant, but I could still feel it there, lingering. I could feel its presence, its gaze, following me. The whispers grew louder now, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but I understood them in a way that made my blood run cold. You shouldn't have set the clock. The words rang in my head like a warning, but it was too late. The sound of the shuffling continued, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving toward me. The figure had moved closer, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I had made a terrible mistake. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stood frozen in the hallway, the faint whispers still echoing in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each creak of the floorboard sent a chill through me, and my legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, to escape the darkness, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. I turned back toward my bedroom, half expecting to see the figure standing at the door, watching me, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, save for the dim glow from the clock in my room. Yet the air felt alive with something else, a presence that didn't belong. I dared to take a cautious step back, toward the safety of my room. As I moved, the whispers faded for a moment, only to be replaced by the softest of sighs, as if something had exhaled behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. I couldn't explain it, but the tension in the air was unbearable. The house felt different, like it had somehow changed while I wasn't looking. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows deeper, the silence oppressive. I finally mustered enough courage to step toward the clock again, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. I needed to stop it. I needed to make it stop. Whatever was happening, it was tied to that damn clock. I reached for the clock and pressed the button to turn it off, but it didn't respond. The time was still 3:33, the display glowing eerily in the dark. I pressed it again, harder this time, but it remained frozen. The buzzing returned. Not the gentle hum of before, but a low, vibrating sound that felt like it was coming from within the walls themselves. The noise seemed to swirl around me, deafening in its intensity. My hands trembled as I tried to unplug the clock from the socket, but it wouldn't budge. The plug felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had frozen to the wall. A feeling of dread washed over me, a gut-wrenching certainty that something far worse was about to happen. The whispers had returned, louder this time, their cadence rapid and frantic. I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but the voices wouldn't stop. They were all around me now, swirling in a cacophony of sound that felt as though it was seeping into my very bones. The whispers weren't just voices anymore, They were words. Words I could understand, words I didn't want to understand. You woke us up. You shouldn't have set the clock. Now you will pay. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. The room seemed to tilt, as though the walls were closing in on me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, as though the entire house had shifted. The buzzing from the clock intensified, vibrating through the walls and floor, shaking the very foundation of the house. And then, the temperature dropped. It was so sudden, so intense, that I gasped as the cold air rushed in, biting at my skin like a sharp blade. My breath formed mist in the air, thick and visible. I could feel it now. Something was moving in the darkness. Something watching me, waiting. I whipped my head around, searching for the source of the cold, but the hallway remained empty. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The clock. The whispers. The cold. They were all connected. I needed to get rid of the clock, but I didn't know how. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The noise sent me reeling in terror. The house was no longer silent, it was alive with movement, with something unnatural. I rushed toward the kitchen, my feet stumbling on the cold floor, my heart racing. Each step felt like an eternity. As I reached the doorway, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the kitchen, was the figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, its form a silhouette against the dim light from the window. It was humanoid, but the shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too large. It didn't have any discernible features, just a black void where its face should have been, a darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And it was staring at me. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, trapped in the grip of terror. The figure didn't make a sound. It didn't move, but the presence of it was suffocating. You should have stayed asleep. The voice, if you could even call it a voice, was like a distant echo in my mind, reverberating in my skull. It didn't come from the figure, but from everywhere. Inside the walls. Inside my head. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and the floor beneath me creaked loudly. My legs gave way, and I fell to the ground, my body trembling uncontrollably. Now you will pay. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on me. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The clock was still ringing, louder than ever. And then, as if the house itself was breathing, everything went silent. The figure was gone. The temperature returned to normal. The buzzing of the clock ceased. But something had changed. The air was thick, and the shadows in the room seemed deeper, darker, more alive. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I spent the rest of the night staring at the clock, my body frozen in fear, but my mind racing. I didn't know what was real anymore. The figure, the whispers, the cold, none of it made sense. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected to that damned alarm clock. I didn't sleep. The minutes passed slowly, and I watched the time tick on the clock, which now read a normal 3:45 a.m. The quiet was deafening after everything that had happened. When the first rays of light began to creep through the blinds, I finally dared to move. I didn't know what else to do. The kitchen was silent, but I could still feel it, the presence of something unseen, just beyond the threshold of my awareness. I stood up from the floor, my legs shaking, and crept toward the front door. I had to leave. I needed space. I needed to get out of the house, away from whatever this was. I quickly grabbed my jacket, my keys, and stepped outside, trying to shake off the terror that had settled in my chest. The cold morning air hit me like a slap, and I inhaled deeply, trying to clear my head. I walked down the sidewalk, hoping the distance would help me calm down, but even the safety of daylight couldn't lift the weight of what had happened. I kept thinking about the clock. What was it? How was it tied to everything? Why had it started ringing at 3:33, and why did it feel like it wanted something? I turned back toward the house after a while. The unease in my gut was overwhelming, but there was a growing need to figure this out, to understand what had happened. When I returned, everything seemed normal. Too normal. The house didn't feel like it had the same presence as before. It was empty, calm. But the air still seemed heavy, like something was waiting for me. I walked into the kitchen and checked the clock. It was still off, the time reading 3:33, but it wasn't buzzing anymore. It just sat there, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't terrorized me in the dead of night. Then I saw it. A small mark, almost imperceptible at first, on the back of my hand. At first, I thought it was a scratch, a figment of my imagination. But when I rubbed it, I felt it, a raised, jagged line, as if something had etched into my skin. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart sinking. It was in the shape of a symbol, something strange, something that didn't belong. It was a circle with 3 lines radiating out from it, and a small dot in the center. I couldn't place it. I didn't recognize it, but it filled me with a sense of unease, of foreboding. It felt wrong. A whisper echoed in my head, so soft that it was barely audible. You are marked. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the same as before. But I couldn't shake the voice, the feeling that it was still there, inside my mind. I quickly ran my fingers over the mark again, but it didn't fade. It was still there, unyielding. My breath quickened as panic rose in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to believe it, but somehow, I knew that the clock had done this. It had left its mark on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept my eyes open, watching the clock and listening to the silence that seemed to stretch forever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen again. The shadows in the room felt like they were alive, crawling toward me. And then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the clock rang again. This time, the sound wasn't like before. It was different. It wasn't a simple buzz, or the sound of an alarm going off. It was a low hum that resonated in my chest, a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I could feel it deep inside me, like something was pulling at me. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The whispers returned, louder now and clearer. You woke us. You brought us back. You will never be free. The air turned cold once again. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The clock's glow grew brighter, almost blinding, until I had to look away. And then I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward me. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The mark on my hand burned, the sensation like fire beneath my skin. The footsteps drew closer, and I could hear them clearer now, slow, heavy, as though someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I didn't know if I should turn around, if I should face whatever was coming for me. But I couldn't seem to control my body. The fear was too much. And then it stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold, all of it vanished. I opened my eyes, my breath shallow and fast. The room was quiet, still. There was nothing. But the mark on my hand was still there, still burning. You are ours now. The voice was right behind me, a cold breath on my ear. I turned, but no one was there. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, as though the quiet itself was just another form of imprisonment. The voices, the footsteps, they had stopped, but they hadn't gone away. I could feel them in the walls, in the air, in my very bones. The mark on my hand burned hotter now, a constant reminder of something I couldn't escape. It was like the house had claimed me, like the very air had become thick with some malevolent presence. I had to get rid of the clock. I had to do something before it was too late. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the clock. It was still there, sitting innocently on the table, its display glowing softly. But I knew better now. It wasn't just a clock. It was the anchor, the source of everything that had happened, everything that was still happening. I had to destroy it. I grabbed the clock, my hands trembling as I lifted it from the table. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt a surge of energy course through me, like a jolt of electricity. The buzzing started again, low at first, then rapidly escalating, shaking the very air around me. The whispers began too, their voices clawing at the edges of my mind, louder now, as if they were trying to push through. You cannot escape us. You belong to us. It's too late for you. I threw the clock to the floor with all my strength, the sharp sound of it hitting the ground echoing in the empty room. But when I looked down, I saw it. The clock was still whole, untouched. It was as if the impact had done nothing at all. And then I noticed something else. The room had changed. At first, I couldn't tell what was different. The walls looked the same, the furniture in place. But the air had shifted. The shadows in the corners were darker, more dense, as if they were pressing in on me. And the temperature had dropped again, so cold that I could see my breath in the air. It wasn't just the chill of winter. It was unnatural. I heard something creaking behind me, a slow, deliberate sound. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. No doors opening, no movement in the corners. Except for the shadow. It was in the farthest corner of the room, barely noticeable at first. But it was there, dark, shifting, twisting in the shape of something unnatural. A presence, a form that didn't belong. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadow grew larger, and with it, the sound of breathing, shallow and raspy, filled the room. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and suffocating, bearing down on me. You have opened the door, the voice whispered, so soft that it was almost inaudible, but it came from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the very air around me. And then I saw it. A door, one that I hadn't noticed before, standing in the farthest corner of the room. It was ancient, its wood warped and splintered, as if it had been untouched for years, maybe longer. The shadow was growing out of it, seeping from beneath the doorframe like ink spilling into water. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It felt as though something was holding me in place, forcing me to look, forcing me to understand. The door creaked open, the sound like the groan of a dying animal. And from within, I saw the darkness, the true darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, something that hungered. The air thickened as the dark tendrils of it began to leak out, swirling like smoke, reaching for me. And then I heard it. A voice. Not one of the whispers, but a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't human, wasn't anything I could identify. It was primal. Raw. You are ours. The words were a command, a declaration of ownership. The shadow around the door seemed to pulse, expanding, contracting, like a living creature. Suddenly, the clock rang again. But this time, it wasn't the same as before. The ringing was different, louder, more distorted, as if the very sound was bending reality itself. I felt my mind start to unravel, as if the noise was digging into the deepest parts of me, carving through my thoughts, pulling at something I couldn't understand. The air grew heavier still. The shadows in the corners moved, creeping slowly toward me, filling the room like a flood. I had to get out. I had to escape before it consumed me completely. But the door was the only way. It was the only way to end this. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move. My legs trembled, and my feet felt like they were wading through thick mud, but I forced myself forward, toward the door. As I reached out to open it, a blast of cold air hit me, and I heard the growling again, louder, closer. The tendrils of darkness reached for me, but I slammed my hand against the door, desperate, frantic. And then it opened. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I was in the darkness. Time, as we understand it, didn't seem to exist in that place. There was no clock, no sense of night or day, only an endless void that stretched out in every direction. It was the kind of dark that presses in from all sides, the kind that feels alive, watching you. I felt like I was drowning in it, suffocating beneath its weight. The whispers began again, not as distant murmurs, but as loud, overlapping voices. They were everywhere. In my ears. In my head. The sound of them was deafening, suffocating. You thought you could escape? You thought you could run from us? We never let go. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The cold was unbearable, sharper now than ever before, cutting into my skin like 1,000 icy needles. Every breath I took felt like ice, burning as it filled my lungs. Then I saw it. A flicker of light, so faint that I almost thought I had imagined it. But no, it was real. The light grew, pulsing like a heartbeat, and with it came the presence, something that had been lurking just beyond my awareness. Something ancient and powerful. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. It was there, watching me, waiting. And I knew, somehow, that I had been pulled into its world. That door had led me into its realm, but placed between places. A place where the rules of reality didn't apply. Where time had no meaning and the shadows were alive. I tried to step back, to retreat into the darkness, but the presence moved toward me. I couldn't see its form, but I felt its gaze, cold and all-consuming. You belong to us now, the voice said, this time not from outside, but from within, as though it was speaking directly to my soul. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear surging through me, my pulse racing as if it were the only thing that could remind me I was still alive. But I wasn't alive anymore, was I? I had been marked. By the clock. By the whispers. By whatever dark force had claimed me. Suddenly, the light grew brighter, blindingly so. It wasn't just light, though. It felt wrong, unnatural. It pulsed with energy, filling the space with an intense warmth, a searing heat that seemed to burn the very fabric of reality. And then, in the middle of that light, I saw something, someone. A figure, standing motionless, but somehow familiar. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the figure stayed the same. It was me. A twisted, contorted version of myself, staring back at me with empty, black eyes, a smile stretched across its face that was anything but human. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, its voice cold, its words hollow. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, but my feet didn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure began to laugh, a sound so empty, so hollow, that it made my skin crawl. And then it reached out. Its hand stretched toward me, long and thin, with fingers that looked like they belonged to something other than human. Before I could react, it touched me. The moment its hand made contact with my skin, a shock of pain shot through me, like 1,000 needles piercing my flesh. My body trembled, and I felt something inside me snap. The pain was unbearable, worse than anything I had ever experienced. But it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the flesh. It was my soul that was being torn apart. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But I couldn't. I couldn't do anything. The figure smiled wider, its grin stretching impossibly far. "You're ours now," it whispered, its voice like a wind that carried 1,000 lost souls. "You'll never escape." The world around me began to warp, the light flickering in and out, and the darkness that had been pressing on me now seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The shadows were closing in, squeezing tighter, suffocating me. I could feel them crawling along my skin, invading my thoughts. And then, in the distance, I heard it. The sound of a clock. The same sound that had haunted me from the beginning, the same sound that had drawn me into this nightmare. The ticking, slow at first, then faster, louder, as if it were coming from all directions at once. "It's not over," the voice in the darkness whispered. "You will always hear it." With that, everything went black. It's funny how sometimes you just end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. I never thought a simple coffee break would lead me to something like this, but that's how it always happens, doesn't it? The thing you least expect creeps up when you're not looking for it. That evening, as the last customer, I stayed a little longer than I should have. It was a small, cozy cafe I often visited after work. The kind of place with faded wooden chairs, the smell of freshly ground coffee beans lingering in the air, and soft jazz music playing in the background. The staff were friendly, the coffee was good, and the atmosphere always made you feel like you could spend hours without noticing the time. But that night, as the clock neared the hour of closing, something felt off. I'd ordered my usual, a cappuccino, and I had planned to sit there for just a few more minutes before heading home. The cafe wasn't crowded, just a few other people, who left one by one. The barista, an older woman named Alice, smiled at me as she cleaned the counter. I didn't pay much attention to the time as I read my book, the dim lighting and soft buzz of the cafe keeping me comfortable. Then, it happened. The lights flickered. At first, it was just a brief moment of dimness, and I thought nothing of it. Power outages weren't unusual, especially with the aging wiring in the building. But then, the flickering began again, this time longer. The fluorescent lights above flickered and buzzed, casting strange shadows on the walls. I glanced around, expecting to see someone else, but I was alone now. Alice had disappeared into the back room without a word. The other customers had already left. It wasn't just the lights, though. There was something in the air, something that didn't feel right. The hum of the coffee machine seemed louder, too loud, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the back, but no one was there. I felt an odd, creeping chill settle over me, like the room itself had become suddenly cold. I checked my watch. It was nearly midnight. "Sorry to keep you," I said, trying to break the eerie silence, but Alice didn't answer. I walked to the counter, wanting to pay and leave, but when I reached for the register, the door clicked shut with a soft, final sound. I turned and saw Alice standing near the door. She was staring at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She looked different. Her usual warmth was gone. "Just a moment," she said in a voice that was too quiet, too controlled. Her words hung in the air, but there was no warmth in them, only an unsettling chill. I thought she was just being strange, maybe annoyed with me for staying too late. But there was something more beneath the surface, something I couldn't put my finger on. I turned back to the counter, attempting to act casual, but when I glanced up again, I noticed something else. The windows, which had once offered a view of the quiet street outside, were now completely dark. There was no street light. No movement. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. The cafe felt closed off, like it was no longer part of the city. Alice didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. I shifted uncomfortably. "Is everything all right?" Her lips twitched, a brief, unsettling smile crossing her face. "Everything is fine, don't worry," she replied, but her voice was flat, emotionless. I felt my skin crawl. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt more aware of the empty space around me. The cafe, once familiar, now felt foreign, like I didn't belong here anymore. Then, without warning, the lights flickered once more. But this time, they didn't just flicker. They went out completely. Darkness swallowed the cafe in an instant. The sound of the humming machines, the soft jazz music, even the faint buzzing of the lights, everything stopped. It was as if the cafe itself had taken a breath and held it. I froze, my eyes straining to adjust to the blackness. Then came the sound of shuffling feet behind me, close, too close. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I spun around, expecting to see Alice, but she wasn't there. There was no one. I was alone in the dark. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and weak in the silence. "Alice?" No answer. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, the faint scent of something metallic, like iron. My heart began to race as panic started to creep in. I could still hear those faint, shuffling footsteps, closer now, almost at my heels. I stumbled backwards, my foot catching on the edge of a chair, and I fell hard onto the floor. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and then a voice. A low whisper, so faint at first I thought I had imagined it. "You shouldn't have stayed." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one. The cafe was empty, silent, and I was still alone, yet I could feel it now. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I pushed myself up, scrambling toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I twisted and pulled, but it was stuck. My breath caught in my throat as I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't leaving. I turned back toward the center of the cafe, my eyes darting around in search of any escape. The shadow in the corner seemed to grow darker, moving slowly, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. And then, through the darkness, I heard it again, the voice, but now it was louder, clearer. It wasn't Alice. It was something else. "You're not going anywhere." The air thickened. The cafe felt like it was closing in on me, its walls bending, shifting, pulling me closer to the center of the room. The shuffling feet started again, and this time they weren't shuffling. They were walking. I turned around quickly, and there she was, Alice. But she wasn't the same. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but they were empty. Hollow. Her smile stretched impossibly wide, her teeth too sharp, too pointed. And before I could react, she whispered one last thing. "Welcome to the last shift." The lights flickered once more. Then they went out completely. The darkness was suffocating, pressing on me like a heavy blanket. I could hear nothing now, just the sound of my own panicked breathing. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine, the taste of fear rising in the back of my throat. I was frozen, paralyzed by the presence I knew was still there, in the room with me, watching me. I took a tentative step back, my foot scraping against the floor, sending a harsh echo through the silence. The air felt thick, like I was wading through water. My hand trembled as I reached out, trying to find the door again, but it was still locked. My heart pounded louder, the frantic rhythm in my chest drowning out everything else. "You're not going anywhere." The voice came from behind me again, but this time it wasn't Alice's. It was something darker. Something that didn't belong in this world. It was a voice I couldn't place, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep beneath the earth. The words slithered into my mind, twisting and curling like a snake. I spun around, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to the darkness, searching for the source of the voice. I could feel the cold air shift, moving around me, as if the room itself was breathing, alive. And then, I saw them. Shadows. Shapes that weren't quite right. They hovered just at the edge of my vision, moving like something out of a nightmare, their forms distorted, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. They seemed to crawl along the walls, across the ceiling, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed in place, my mind screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. A scraping sound echoed across the room, sharp, like nails on glass. The noise came from the back of the cafe, where I had seen Alice disappear earlier. My eyes snapped to the corner, and for a split second, I thought I saw her again, only this time, she wasn't standing. She was kneeling on the floor, her hands pressed to the ground as if she were listening to something. Her head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and her mouth was stretched open, wider than should have been possible. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Something inside me, something dark, held me in place, rooted to the spot. The voice came again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple voices, overlapping, whispering, laughing. The sound filled the cafe, reverberating off the walls until it was all I could hear. "You shouldn't have stayed." I closed my eyes tightly, willing the sound to stop. But the more I fought it, the stronger the voices became. They were inside my head now, burrowing deep, drowning out my thoughts. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The voices stopped. The darkness faded, not completely, but enough for me to see again. The room felt different now, quieter. The weight in the air had lifted, but it had left something behind. Something cold, empty, and heavy. I opened my eyes slowly, taking in my surroundings. The cafe looked the same, but it wasn't. The walls were still the same faded yellow, the wooden tables and chairs still scattered around, but there was something wrong. The space felt smaller, more confining, like the walls were closing in just a little bit at a time. I looked to the counter, expecting to see Alice, but there was no sign of her. The back room was dark, and the kitchen door was closed. The air smelled different too, more metallic now, like old coins or blood. It made my stomach turn. I reached for my phone, fumbling with my hands as I tried to turn on the flashlight. But when I glanced at the screen, I froze. There was no signal. I couldn't text anyone. I couldn't call for help. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was completely cut off from the outside world. My pulse quickened. I had to get out. I didn't care how or why. I just needed to leave this place. I tried the door again, yanking on the handle with all my strength. Still nothing. No give. Then I heard it again. The shuffling footsteps. The sound of movement, soft and slow, from somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of life, but there was nothing. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to shift, like it was watching me. That's when I saw it, her. Alice. She was standing in the far corner, her back turned to me, her hands by her sides, her head tilted downward. Her body was completely still. But the air around her felt wrong, like it was buzzing with something dark. Something unnatural. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but my voice cracked in fear. I took a step toward her, but she didn't move. I called out her name, but no response. She remained motionless, like a statue. And then, without warning, her head snapped up. Her eyes were wide open, but they were not Alice's eyes. They were empty, black voids, as though her entire soul had been sucked away. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. I could feel the cold sweat running down my face, my hands trembling. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, like it was shifting, and I couldn't trust anything I saw. The lights flickered again, this time lasting longer, and I heard a whisper. "You're not meant to leave." The cafe felt like it was alive now, pressing in from every direction. The walls, the tables, the chairs, they were all moving, ever so slightly, as if they were closing in on me. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the cold, metallic scent filled my nostrils. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if something worse was going on. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. I backed away from Alice, every fiber of my being screaming to run. But there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to lean in closer, the ceiling lower. The cafe had stopped feeling like a familiar place. It was no longer just a quiet, comfortable spot for coffee. It had become something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I looked around frantically, searching for an escape, but all I saw were shadows creeping across the room. The same shadows from before, moving just beyond the edges of my vision. I turned toward the door, but it was still locked, and the key was nowhere to be found. The windows were too high to reach, and I was trapped in here with her, the woman whose eyes had swallowed all the light. A sound broke through the silence, sharp and sudden, like the clink of a glass hitting the floor. I spun back toward the counter, where a cup of coffee had been resting before. Now, the cup was shattered, the liquid spilling onto the countertop. but no one had touched it. The air was thick with the feeling of something watching me. Not just Alice, something else was there, something that felt ancient, far older than this cafe, than this town. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. I took a breath, steadying myself as best as I could. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, no matter the cost. I turned back toward Alice, her figure now standing motionless, her head tilted in an unnatural angle, her hollow eyes staring straight through me. I could feel a pressure in my chest, like the very air was constricting around me. She opened her mouth slowly, and for a moment, I thought she would speak. But instead, a voice, not hers, spilled out. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was distant, ethereal, like it was coming from far beneath the ground. I couldn't place it, but it chilled me to my core. I felt the floor beneath me tremble slightly, the vibrations crawling up my legs. My heart pounded as I took another step back, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breath. The room felt smaller with each passing second, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Every corner seemed to hide something, every shadow concealing a new terror. Then, the lights flickered once more, and this time they didn't just flicker, they went out completely. The cafe plunged into complete darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat now, echoing in my ears, as the silence stretched on. I was alone in this darkness, surrounded by nothing but the smell of stale coffee and fear. And then, the footsteps began. At first, it was just a soft tapping, barely audible above the pounding of my heart. But the sound grew louder, closer, as if something was approaching from the back of the room. My eyes strained against the blackness, but there was nothing, no one. The tapping grew into a slow, deliberate stride, like someone walking toward me in the dark. I could feel the presence moving, watching me, as it closed in. I turned, panicked, and scrambled toward the nearest table, gripping the edge for support. My hands were slick with sweat, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the horror unfolding around me. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything besides the ever-growing footsteps. The air became thick again, heavier than before, as if I was breathing through water. The silence was suffocating, but in it, I could hear a faint whisper, closer now. "Leave." It was a voice I didn't recognize. Low and rasping, like a wind that had been trapped in a bottle for centuries. I spun around, trying to make sense of the words, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The footsteps stopped. The voice lingered, still echoing in my head, but the air felt wrong. I wasn't alone anymore. The presence was stronger now, suffocating me, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I gasped, stumbling backward, and that's when I felt it. A cold hand brushed against my arm, ice cold, like it had just been pulled out of a freezer. I turned sharply, my heart racing in my chest, but there was nothing there. No one. I was alone. But the sensation remained, a cold spot against my skin, lingering long after I had moved. It was as if someone was still standing behind me, their breath hot against my neck. "You're not leaving." The words rang out louder this time, as if they were coming from the walls themselves, reverberating through the room. The darkness seemed to press closer, to swallow me whole. I ran. I bolted for the back door, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. I couldn't see. I didn't care. I just had to get out. But the door, it was locked. I slammed my palm against the cold metal, the pressure in my chest growing heavier, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no way out. No escape. I turned, desperate, and looked back toward Alice, but she was gone. The shadows, though, remained. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. And then, suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But the cafe had changed. It was darker now, different. And I was no longer alone. I stood there, frozen, as the dim lights flickered back on. The cafe was no longer the place I knew. The walls had darkened, the air was thick with a damp coldness, and the faint hum of the lights seemed to vibrate with an ominous presence. It felt as though the space around me had twisted into something unrecognizable. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to find some semblance of reality in the madness. But everything was wrong. The chairs that had been neatly arranged before were now scattered across the floor, as if someone had knocked them over in a hurry. The counter was a mess, cups and plates piled haphazardly, some cracked, others shattered. And the smell. There was something metallic in the air now, a scent like rust mixed with the faintest trace of decay. My stomach churned, and my head spun. I had to get out. But the door still wouldn't open. I grabbed the handle again, this time with all the force I could muster, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse quickened as panic rose in my chest. I was trapped. And I wasn't alone. The shadows were moving again. They weren't just static forms in the corners of the room anymore. They were shifting, slithering, creeping along the walls and floor. I could hear their whispers now, low and indistinct, like 1,000 voices talking at once, but none of them making sense. I backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the room, searching for anything, anyone. But there was no one. Just the oppressive weight of the dark shapes that had taken over the cafe. Help me. I spun around at the sound of the voice, so faint it was almost drowned out by the shifting shadows. But there it was again, a soft, pleading whisper. Please, help me. It sounded like a woman, desperate and afraid, and the voice seemed to be coming from somewhere deep inside the cafe, perhaps from the storage room in the back, or even under the floorboards. I couldn't tell. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I had to find the source. I had to know what was happening. Without thinking, I moved toward the back of the cafe, my feet dragging heavily on the floor. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and every step felt like it took me further away from any sense of reality. The whispers grew louder as I approached the door to the storage room. The air was thick with something that made my skin crawl, a sensation like invisible hands pressing against my chest. My heart pounded in my throat, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I reached for the door handle, but before I could touch it, the whisper stopped. Silence. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the handle. Something inside me screamed to turn around, to leave, to run as far as I could. But I couldn't. Not now. I had to know what was on the other side. I pushed the door open. The room inside was small, cluttered with shelves full of boxes and forgotten supplies. It was dark, darker than the rest of the cafe, and the air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But there was something else, something wrong. I stepped inside, and as soon as my foot crossed the threshold, I heard it. A soft, scuttling sound, like something moving quickly across the floor. My eyes darted to the shadows, but there was nothing there. Except the floor. It wasn't the smooth wood I had expected. It was different. The planks were uneven, warped, as though they had been lifted and replaced in a haphazard fashion. And there, in the far corner of the room, was a small hole in the floor, a hole that hadn't been there before. Something was moving beneath it. I could feel it, the air shifting, the ground beneath me vibrating just slightly. The hole was alive with something I couldn't see. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound of scratching intensified, a soft but unmistakable scraping coming from below. It was trying to get out. I stepped back, my breath quickening, and then I heard it again, that voice. "Help me." It was no longer a whisper. It was a desperate, raw plea that echoed through the room. I spun around, but the door had closed behind me. I was locked in. The temperature dropped again, and I could see my breath puffing out in front of me like a cloud of fog. The shadows were closing in, creeping toward me from every corner. My heart raced as I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shapes, indistinct forms in the darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out their outlines, figures. Tall, twisted shapes, their features hidden beneath layers of shadow. Their eyes, if they had eyes, glowed faintly, like the light from a distant fire, burning with an unnatural intensity. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The only thing I could do was run. I rushed toward the back of the room, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. No windows, no doors. Just walls closing in around me. The figures began to move, their steps heavy, slow, deliberate. They were coming closer. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was unmistakable now. It was the same voice that had spoken earlier, the one that seemed to come from everywhere. It wasn't Alice. It wasn't human. And it was getting closer. With no choice left, I bolted toward the far wall, grabbing at anything I could find. My hand closed around a metal pipe, cold and heavy in my grip. It felt like the only thing keeping me from falling apart. The figures were nearly upon me now. I turned to face them, raising the pipe, ready to fight for my life. But just as I swung it toward the nearest shadow, everything stopped. The shadows. The figures. The voice. Gone. I was left standing alone in the room, breathless, trembling, surrounded by silence. But I knew they weren't gone. They were still here. The silence was suffocating. It pressed down on me from every angle, thick and oppressive, as though the very air had turned to stone. My heart pounded in my ears, and every breath I took seemed to echo in the emptiness, magnifying my sense of isolation. I stood frozen, my grip still tight on the cold metal pipe, eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows, those dark, twisted shapes, had vanished, but the feeling of something lurking remained. They hadn't disappeared, they were just waiting. I took a tentative step forward, my footfall sounding like thunder in the stillness. Each sound I made felt like it was drawing their attention. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that the shadows were not far, that they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I needed to escape. The front door had to be open now. There was no other choice. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen, gripped by the fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. Every corner seemed to hold something just beyond my reach, just beyond my comprehension. I moved toward the back door again, hesitant, as though the room itself was conspiring to keep me inside. My hand reached for the door handle, but before I could touch it, I heard it, that voice, again. "You can't leave." The words were cold, distant, but unmistakable. I whipped around, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the room was still. Too still. And then I saw it. A figure, standing by the counter, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape was distorted, shifting in and out of focus. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague silhouette of something that wasn't quite human. The figure began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately, its steps almost soundless. Each movement seemed to send a ripple through the air, making the room feel colder, darker. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, as if the very ground was holding me in place. "You stayed too long." The voice came again, closer this time, its tone tinged with something that sent a wave of dread washing over me. I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me, but I couldn't look away. I had to know what it was. It reached the counter, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, what was left of it. It was a grotesque mask of twisted features, like something half-formed, its eyes dark pits of emptiness. The skin was stretched tight across its skull, and its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. The pipe slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. My breath came in sharp gasps, panic threatening to overtake me. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. And then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, it spoke again. "You are ours now." The room seemed to close in around me. The walls, the air, everything was closing in on me, like a vice tightening around my chest. I could feel it, a pressure, suffocating, unbearable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The room fell back into an eerie calm. The figure was gone. I looked around, blinking in confusion, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing was making sense. The cafe was silent once again, the shadows no longer moving, no longer shifting. Everything was still, as though the terror I had just experienced was nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle once more. This time, it opened. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, my heart still racing. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I took deep, desperate breaths, trying to calm myself. The cafe behind me was dark, its windows lifeless, the lights long extinguished. It looked just like any other cafe, the way it had been before, all normal. But I knew that what had happened wasn't just some figment of my imagination. The cafe had changed. The figures had been real. And they had claimed me. As I walked away, the silence followed me, the shadows lingering in the corners of my mind. I knew they were still there, waiting for me to return. And one day, I would, because they had never let me leave. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, even when no one was around? I used to think that was just a trick of the mind. Something that happened in moments of isolation or uncertainty. But I don't think that anymore. It started when I moved into the old apartment. It was small, a bit run down, but it was affordable, and that was all I cared about at the time. The kind of place you could disappear into, not expecting much but peace and quiet. Or so I thought. The first few days were normal. The creaks of the building settling, the hum of the old radiator, that was to be expected. But then the sounds began. Quiet at first, almost indistinguishable from the noises of the building. I told myself it was just the pipes, the wind, maybe even the apartment's previous tenants leaving their mark. But soon, the whispers began. Soft murmurs at first, as if the walls were alive. At night, when the world outside my window fell silent, these murmurs would grow clearer, sharper. It was as if they were speaking to me. Sometimes they were just fragments, barely audible, like the tail end of a conversation. Other times, the voices were so distinct, I could swear they were right there with me. He's here. It's him. Is he the one? No, it can't be him. I froze the first time I heard them. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the next night, the voices came again. More distinct. More deliberate. They were talking about me, about my arrival. How could they know? I hadn't even told anyone where I moved yet. I had barely unpacked. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But that evening, when I sat on the couch, the whispers came again. Only this time, they were different. Louder. They weren't just coming from the walls anymore, they were coming from all around me. I stood up, heart pounding, straining to hear. It was as if the sound was right behind me. Don't let him stay. He doesn't belong here. I whipped around. There was no one. Of course, there wasn't. The room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic outside. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. But as the days went by, the whispers only grew. They were coming from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. It didn't matter where I went in the apartment, they followed me. I could hear them in every room, every corner, every time I closed my eyes to sleep. They spoke about me, but they spoke in riddles. In fragments. I started questioning my own sanity. Was it stress? Was I just imagining things? But then, something happened that I couldn't explain away. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to block out the whispers, I heard a knock at the door. 3 distinct raps. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up slowly, not sure what to expect. When I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty, just like I knew it would be. But then I looked down, and there, on the floor, was a small scrap of paper. I bent down, heart racing, and picked it up. The handwriting was strange, almost too neat, too deliberate. Don't trust the walls. I stood there for a long moment, the paper crinkling in my hand. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the words on that note felt like an echo, bouncing around in my head. I shoved the note into my pocket and closed the door, my mind racing. What did it mean? Who had left it? As I turned to head back to my apartment, I heard it again, louder this time, unmistakable. He's not supposed to be here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the apartment anymore. It wasn't just the walls. It was something more. Something I couldn't explain. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain, whatever was going on, it wasn't going to stop. Not unless I figured out what was really happening here. The next few days felt like a blur. I tried to ignore the whispers, tried to convince myself that everything was just in my head, but it wasn't working. The more I denied it, the louder the voices became. And the more I listened, the more details began to emerge. At first, it was all bits and pieces, like a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. But then, the voices began to form sentences, full thoughts, conversations. I could hear them clearly now, not just from the walls, but from the very air around me. I had to admit it to myself, I wasn't imagining things. They won't leave, it's always like this, don't let him stay. The words seemed to taunt me. They knew what I was thinking. They knew what I was feeling. One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. I had to find out what was behind these voices. Maybe it was something to do with the apartment. Maybe it was the building itself, something old, something buried, something that had been there long before I arrived. I spent the day searching online, looking for any history on the place. The landlord had given me only the most basic details, built in the early 20th century, small building, nothing remarkable. But I knew better. There had to be something. And there it was, buried deep in an old article I almost missed. A brief mention of a tragedy that had occurred in the apartment building over 50 years ago. A man, a tenant, who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. No one ever figured out what happened to him, but rumors had swirled about strange happenings in the building ever since. The whispers, the noises. They had all started after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices were connected to him. The missing tenant. His life, or what had been left of it. That night, I decided to confront the apartment. To really listen. I sat in the center of the living room, my back pressed against the floorboards, my ears straining for any sound. I didn't want to hear them, but I knew I had no choice. At first, nothing. Silence. But then, as the clock ticked past midnight, they started again. They're here. They always come. He's here. I froze. This time, the voices didn't just seem to come from the walls. They were everywhere, surrounding me. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing with the whispers of long-forgotten souls. I could hear footsteps now, soft at first, but growing louder. Slow, deliberate. The floorboards creaked in the corners of the room. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. I stood up, trying to move quietly, not wanting to alert whoever was in the apartment with me. I walked toward the hallway, my feet barely making a sound. But the footsteps followed me. Closer. I reached the bathroom door, my hand shaking as I touched the handle. The voices were growing more frantic now, as if they knew I was about to uncover something. You shouldn't look, don't open it. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open. There, in the bathroom mirror, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A shadow. But not just any shadow. It wasn't cast by anything in the room. It wasn't a reflection. It was darker than the darkness of the room itself, like a hole in space. And within it, I could see a figure, an outline of a man. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew it was him. The one the voices had been talking about. He was staring right at me. I gasped and stumbled back, slamming the door shut. I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in sharp, panic bursts. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But I knew what I had seen. I could still feel his presence. He was here. The voices were silent now, but I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't live like this, trapped in a place where I was being haunted by the past, by something I didn't understand. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. A small piece of paper on the floor, just like the one before. I bent down, fingers trembling, and read the words scrawled across it. He never left. I stood up, the weight of those words crashing down on me. He never left. The man, the missing tenant, the one whose life was still echoing through these walls. He hadn't just disappeared. He had stayed. And now, he was watching me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every corner of the apartment felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The shadow in the bathroom, the whispers from the walls, he never left. Those words kept ringing in my mind, repeating over and over again like a terrible chant. I had to leave. That was my first instinct. Get out of there and never look back. But the rational part of me, the part that tried to dismiss all of this as an overactive imagination, fought it. What if it was all in my head? What if I was just making something out of nothing? The mind can play tricks when you're sleep deprived, I told myself. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't just my mind. The atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The next day, I decided to do what I should have done from the start, find out more about the man in the story. I couldn't ignore the eerie coincidence that his presence seemed tied to this apartment, to these strange occurrences. His disappearance. The voices. The shadow in the mirror. I called the landlord again, but this time I was more direct. Can you tell me anything more about the man who disappeared here? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The kind of pause that suggested the person on the other side was debating whether or not to give me an answer. When he finally spoke, his tone was low, almost conspiratorial. You're asking about Gregory, aren't you? He said, as though saying the name itself was forbidden. Gregory? That's the man who disappeared? I pressed. Yes, the landlord answered. He was a quiet fellow. Stayed to himself, kept mostly in his apartment. No one ever knew much about him. One night, he just vanished. No sign of a struggle, no trace. The police couldn't find anything. But strange things started happening after that. People would hear things, whispers, movements in the night. You might even say the building changed. He paused, as if he were weighing the consequences of continuing. They say Gregory never left. That his spirit still roams these halls. I swallowed hard. I could hear the fear in his voice, the same fear that had gripped me since the moment I first heard those whispers. Do you mean to say the building is haunted? I asked, unable to mask the tremor in my voice. The landlord didn't answer right away. Let's just say, strange things happen in that apartment. People who've lived there often move out sooner than expected. Some never come back. I felt the blood drain from my face. Some never come back. Have you ever had anyone else who heard the voices? I asked quietly. The landlord's response was immediate. I don't know what you've been hearing, but if I were you, I'd leave the apartment as soon as possible. This is no ordinary place. I hung up the phone without another word, my heart racing. I didn't need to ask any more questions. I had my answer. Gregory's spirit was still here, lingering in the shadows, leaving his imprint on everything. And I was stuck in the middle of it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. The apartment seemed even colder now, as if it was holding its breath. I didn't dare look in the bathroom mirror again, but I could feel his presence just beyond the corner of my vision. The whispers returned, faint but undeniable, coming from the walls, from the floor beneath my feet. The more I listened, the clearer the voices became. He's awake, he's coming, it's too late to leave. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. I wasn't going to wait around any longer. I had to get out of there, no matter what. I rushed down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. The air felt thick and suffocating. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. But when I reached the door, my heart stopped. The door was locked. I checked the handle again, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the key, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, unyielding. My breath became shallow as I backed away from the door, panic creeping in. The voices had stopped, but I could feel them just beyond my reach, like a pressure in the air, pushing against me. I turned toward the window. Maybe I could break it, climb out, anything to escape. But as I reached the window, I froze. Outside, in the dark alley below, a figure stood, facing the building. It was Gregory. He was standing perfectly still, his face hidden in shadow, his posture unnaturally rigid. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't even breathe. And then, as if he knew I was watching, he slowly turned his head towards the window, locking eyes with me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was something darker, something that made my blood run cold. The smile of a man who had long since stopped being human. And then, without warning, the lights flickered once more, plunging the apartment into darkness. I wasn't alone anymore. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The light flickered again, this time briefly, but it was enough for me to see the shadow move, just a blur at the corner of my vision. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. He was still out there. Gregory, or whatever was left of him, was watching me. I didn't know how, but I could feel his presence, like a cold draft sweeping across my skin. I wasn't sure if he was in the alley anymore or if he was right here, in the apartment with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a cold shiver ran through me. I needed to leave. Now. I turned back to the door, trying once again to force the lock open. My fingers were numb from fear, fumbling over the key, but it refused to turn. Panic clawed at my chest as I heard a soft thud from behind me, a sound like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. The apartment was still, too still. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow, reaching out, consuming everything in their path. I was trapped. The voices began again, softer now, almost like a whisper in the wind. I could barely make out the words, but they were unmistakable. He knows you're here. He knows everything. I backed away from the door, my legs shaking beneath me. I had to get out. I had to escape, but where would I go? How could I run from something that wasn't bound by the same rules of the world I knew? This apartment, this place, it wasn't just a home. It was a trap. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, faint at first, like something dragging across the floor. It came from the hallway. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The scraping grew louder, closer, as though whatever was making the noise was moving toward me. The hair on my arms stood up as I tried to listen, trying to make sense of it, but it wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling that accompanied it. The heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to fill the room, making it harder to breathe. And then I saw it. A shadow stretching across the floor, slithering like a living thing. It moved under the door, creeping toward me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of it, the sheer force of its presence. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something alive. I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it out of that room. My mind was clouded with terror, my body moving on instinct alone, but somehow I found myself in the hallway, running toward the stairs. The voices, the footsteps, they were all around me now, in my ears, in my head, filling the space. But when I reached the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the bottom of the staircase stood Gregory. His figure was clearer now, more solid, and his face twisted into that same eerie smile. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice low and cold, seeping into my skin. I felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare into his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, feeling the grip of terror tightening around me. "Gregory." My voice trembled, barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, unmoving, like he was savoring my fear. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand, pointing toward the door. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing, distorted, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. "But now you're part of it. You'll never leave. We all stay here." The air in the hallway grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and I could feel it in my bones, the chill creeping into every inch of my skin. I had no choice. I turned, desperate to escape, but just as my foot hit the first step, I heard the sound of the door behind me, closing. It was locked. Again. I had no way out. The lights flickered once more, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw it, a figure standing behind Gregory, just beyond his shadow, watching me. A figure so faint, so pale, I could barely make it out. But I saw it. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was someone else. Someone trapped here too. "Gregory." I screamed, my voice breaking. "What have you done to them?" He didn't respond. He just kept smiling that cold, unfeeling smile. I wanted to run, to escape, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized something. There was no escape. The apartment, the building, everything about it was wrong. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, pulsing with something dark and ancient, and I was now a part of it. I had stepped into its web, and I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly, the whispers became clear, louder, merging together into one horrifying truth. "You're one of us now. Forever." And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the building seemed as it always had. Quiet. Peaceful. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. I didn't know how long I'd been gone, how long it had been since I last saw the light of day. Time had lost all meaning. I could still hear the whispers, faint in the back of my mind. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel his presence, Gregory, always watching, always waiting. I'm not alone in this apartment anymore. And I never will be. I am a part of the echo now. A part of his life. It's been days, or maybe weeks. Time has become irrelevant in this place. I can't remember the exact moment I realized it, but now it's impossible to ignore. The whispers are no longer just in my head. They're everywhere. Faint at first, almost like a dream you can't remember fully, but now they're clear. They're real. And they're getting louder. I feel them when I wake up in the morning, when I turn over in bed and stretch my tired limbs. At night, they curl around me like a blanket of darkness, whispering in my ears as I try to sleep. The voices, they're not just echoes of the past anymore. They speak to me, call to me, urge me to listen, to be. They've started repeating things. Words I don't remember saying. Conversations that don't make sense. He's awake now. He knows. We all know. The voices are no longer just distant murmurs. They're here, inside my mind, like memories that never belonged to me. I see their faces sometimes, fading in and out of my vision. A woman's face, her eyes wide with fear. A man in a suit, smiling a smile too wide to be human. And then, there's Gregory. He's still here, though I don't see him anymore. I can feel him. He's always here. His presence is in the walls, in the air I breathe, in every corner of the room. I can almost hear his footsteps echoing through the apartment, although I never see him. He doesn't need to show himself anymore. He's woven himself into the fabric of this place. I try to leave. I really do. Every day, I find myself standing at the door, my hand on the handle, but something pulls me back. It's as though the apartment itself refuses to let me go. The door always locks itself. The windows don't open. The hallways twist, reshaping themselves into unfamiliar paths, leading me in circles. I am trapped. We are all trapped. The woman, the man, they don't speak anymore. Not directly to me. But I can feel their eyes on me, watching, judging. The space seems to shift around me, closing in, becoming tighter, as if the walls themselves are inching closer. But worst of all is the sense of knowing, of being part of something larger, something sinister. I wasn't just living in this apartment anymore. I was becoming it. I could feel myself changing. It wasn't just the physical space that was distorting. Something inside me was shifting too. My thoughts, my memories, they weren't my own. I don't know how long it's been since I last spoke to anyone. The neighbors? They've vanished. No one comes here anymore. Sometimes I hear the doorbell ring, but when I answer, no one's there. When I check the peephole, it's empty. I used to wonder if I was going mad. Now I know the truth. I'm not mad. I'm part of this place. Just like Gregory. Just like the others before me. We are all part of the echo. And there is no escape. I can feel it now, an ever-growing presence behind me, watching, waiting. The silence is unbearable, but I'm not alone. I can't be alone. Not anymore. I turn away from the mirror. My reflection grins back at me, but it's not my smile. It's Gregory's. It's the man's smile. The woman's. It's the smile of everyone who's ever been trapped here. Everyone who became the echo. And I realize, with a sickening certainty, that I've already forgotten how to leave. There's nothing left of who I was. Only the echo remains. And now, I'm the one who will call to the next. Have you ever had a feeling that someone is watching you? It's a strange, unsettling thought, one you can't quite shake off no matter how hard you try. I used to brush it off, dismiss it as paranoia, but it started with something too real to ignore. Something that couldn't be explained away. It began with the first envelope. No name, no return address. Just a plain white envelope sitting in my mailbox, wedged between the usual bills and junk mail. I wasn't expecting anything. Curiosity pulled at me as I slid my finger under the flap and opened it, revealing a photo. The photo was of me, but not in a place I had been. Not in any place I recognized. It was taken from an angle I couldn't quite place, looking through the window of a cafe down the street from my apartment. I wasn't there. I hadn't been there. The image was grainy, but the details were clear enough. It was a shot of me, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop. The blinds were slightly drawn, the light from the window casting a faint shadow across my face. The strangest thing? I hadn't seen anyone standing outside. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake. A coincidence. But then the second envelope arrived a week later. This time, it was a photograph of me walking through the park at dusk. I remember that day. It had been cloudy, the sky darkening fast, and I had walked past the old oak tree where kids used to play. But I didn't remember anyone taking my picture, let alone catching me from the other side of the park. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't explain how they got these photos. I didn't remember seeing anyone with a camera. I hadn't noticed any other people around me at those times. Who was this person? And why was I being watched? I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had taken the photos and was just messing with me. But then, the third letter arrived. And this one wasn't a photograph. It was a message. The handwriting was different from the typewritten notes in the previous letters, but the chilling words were unmistakable. Stay home. The cold shiver that ran down my spine was enough to make me lock the door and draw the curtains tightly. It felt threatening, as if the sender was daring me to do something, to step outside, to move in any direction other than the one they had already planned for me. I tried to ignore it. I even told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, every unfamiliar sound coming from the apartment building next door sent my mind spiraling. The walls felt thinner, as if they could no longer hide my every movement. As if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I started checking the locks on the door obsessively. The windows. Every corner of my apartment felt like a potential hiding place for someone. But no matter how many times I checked, the photos still kept coming. Each one felt like a closer look into my life, like someone was getting closer to me, closer to the truth that was buried deep inside. I stopped going out as much. The letters, no, the photographs, kept appearing at random intervals. Each one felt more sinister than the last. The places were stranger. The angles more precise. Whoever was watching me knew too much. They saw things no one should know. The worst part? I started hearing things. Small sounds. Scratching at the door. A faint tapping on the window late at night, so quiet I wasn't sure if I imagined it. I pulled back the curtain to find nothing but the empty street below. I thought I was losing my mind. But it wasn't just in my head. It was real. Whoever was out there had found a way to get close, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that I was safe. It's been days since the last letter arrived. I haven't left my apartment. I don't know what will happen if I do. But I know one thing for sure. Someone is watching me. And whatever it is, I don't think it's going to stop. It's hard to explain the feeling, but every corner of my apartment now feels like a trap. The walls are too thin, the shadows too heavy. I can't shake the feeling that at any moment someone will step out from behind the curtains, from inside the closet, or from the darkened corner of the hallway. The weight of being watched has become unbearable, and I find myself checking every inch of my apartment multiple times a day, peering under the bed, behind the couch, in the kitchen cupboards. But it's not just the physical space that's becoming oppressive, it's the silence. The silence that follows me wherever I go. I can't remember the last time I heard the hum of traffic outside or the sound of children playing in the street. It's like the world has gone quiet, as though the city itself is holding its breath, waiting. The letters stopped for a while after the last one, but that didn't help. If anything, the silence made it worse. It was as if the person behind it all was taking their time, planning the next move. I couldn't just sit around, waiting. I needed to do something. So, I started looking for answers. I tried reaching out to the post office, but they couldn't find any information about the sender. No records, no trace of where the envelopes were coming from. It was like they just appeared out of nowhere. And the photographs, how were they taken without me noticing? Were there hidden cameras in my apartment? Were the walls themselves somehow involved? The fear gnawed at me, but it was mixed with something else, curiosity. I needed to know what was happening, what was behind all of this. So, I decided to take a risk. I had to go outside. Not for long, but just long enough to see if anyone was watching me in person. I chose a quiet evening, just after the sun dipped below the horizon. The street lights flickered on as I stepped out onto the front stoop of my building. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow. The air was cool, and the world outside felt wrong. The street was empty. Not a soul in sight. It was too quiet. I stood there, in the shadows, waiting. My eyes darted from one darkened corner to the next. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. Every street lamp cast an eerie glow, and the silence made my skin crawl. I took a few cautious steps down the street, glancing around constantly, listening intently. Then, I heard it. A faint rustling, like a piece of paper fluttering in the wind. But there was no wind. I froze. The sound was coming from across the street, near the alley that ran behind the bakery. I couldn't see anything, but the rustling persisted. My instincts told me to move, to run back to my apartment, but something held me in place. The rustling stopped abruptly. I held my breath. And then, I saw it. A figure. A silhouette in the alleyway. A person. Tall, thin, with a hood covering their head. I couldn't make out any details, but the way they stood, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something, made my heart race. Was this the person? The one who'd been sending the letters? I took a step back, but my foot hit something loud enough to break the silence. The figure's head snapped in my direction. I froze, but they didn't move. They didn't approach me, didn't make any attempt to come closer. They just stared. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer. My heart was in my throat as I bolted back to the building, taking the stairs two at a time. I fumbled with my keys at the door, my hands trembling as I finally shoved the key into the lock. When I finally stepped inside and slammed the door behind me, I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I could hear nothing. Not even the hum of the city, just my own ragged breathing. But there was something else. A sound. The faintest scratching, coming from the inside of the door. I jumped back, my heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the other side, right where the door frame met the wall. What the hell is happening? I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and pressed it against the door as if it would somehow stop whatever was on the other side from getting in. My mind raced. Was it them? Was someone standing outside my door, waiting for me to make a mistake? Or was it something worse, something I couldn't explain? The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A small, folded piece of paper was wedged in the crack beneath the door. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to read it. But something inside me, something desperate for answers, compelled me to do so. I opened the note carefully, my fingers shaking. It read, "I see you." A chill ran down my spine, and I realized, whatever was happening, it was only getting started. I couldn't stop shaking. I stood there, the note in my hand, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. "I see you." The words echoed in my head over and over again until they lost all meaning. I couldn't understand how the person knew where I was, what I was doing, but it was clear now this wasn't some twisted prank. It was personal. I dropped the note on the floor as if it might somehow come alive and bite me. My apartment felt suffocating. I couldn't stay in here anymore. I had to get out. I needed air. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and left, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. The night outside was colder than I expected, a sharp chill that cut right through my clothes. I needed to be far from my apartment. I couldn't be alone with my thoughts. I wandered aimlessly, my eyes darting over every person I passed, every shadow that seemed to move just a little too quickly. No one paid me any attention, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. The more I walked, the more I became aware of every single noise, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the faintest scuff of shoes against the pavement. It was too quiet, too controlled. Like the city was holding its breath, just like I had felt back at my apartment. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the apartment, from that horrible note, from the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I found myself at the edge of the park, the last place I thought I'd go at this hour. It was empty, save for a few scattered benches, and the overgrown trees that seemed to reach for the sky like twisted fingers. The park felt different tonight, darker, somehow. Even the air seemed to weigh heavier. I sat down on one of the benches, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. But no matter how hard I thought, I kept coming back to the same question: who was doing this to me? And why? Suddenly, a soft sound broke through my thoughts, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned my head, but saw nothing. The sound stopped, but I could still feel eyes on me. Focus, focus, I told myself. Don't panic. But it was too late. Panic had already settled deep in my chest. I stood up abruptly, looking around in every direction, my heart pounding. The footsteps resumed, but now they were behind me. I turned around quickly, but again, there was no one. The air around me felt heavier, pressing in from all sides. I could hear the rush of my own blood in my ears, feel the sweat on my palms. I should have left. I should have just gone home, locked myself inside, and never come out again. But then something caught my eye. A figure, standing at the edge of the park, just beyond the light of the nearest street lamp. It was too far to make out any details, but I could feel the gaze, heavy, unblinking, fixated on me. Without thinking, I started walking toward it, as if I could somehow confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. But as I moved closer, the figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, staring at me. The closer I got, the more it felt like I was walking into a trap. But I couldn't stop myself. There was something drawing me in, some twisted urge that made me keep moving. Finally, I stopped just a few feet away from the figure. It stood there, still as a statue, its face obscured by a hood, a shadowy figure. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my throat felt tight, my words caught in a knot. Then, in a voice that sounded like it came from far away, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to notice my fear. It was almost like it was waiting for me to react. And then, as if the words had triggered something, the figure stepped into the light. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was something wrong. Something twisted, like a human shape, but not quite. The edges of its body seemed to blur, like it was made from darkness itself. The face was hidden, but the outline of it, the way it shimmered, made my skin crawl. The thing didn't have eyes, not like a normal person, but something darker. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I turned and ran, as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. I don't know how long I ran for, or where I went, but I eventually found myself back at my apartment, breathless and shaking. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and slid down against it, trying to calm my breathing. The figure had been real. I wasn't imagining things. It wasn't just a hallucination. And somehow, that made everything worse. The silence of my apartment felt like a tomb. But the fear that had been building inside me, the dread that something was coming for me, was no longer just a feeling. It was a reality. And I knew, deep down, that whoever, or whatever, was behind this, wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that figure lurking in the distance, waiting for me to slip up. I didn't even dare look in the direction of the park. The streets felt different, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to go about my day, as if everything was normal. I brewed some coffee, tried to check my emails, but every sound seemed too loud, too close. The creak of the floorboards in the hallway made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator felt like it was vibrating through my skull. I was constantly on edge, unable to focus on anything. But then, the doorbell rang. I froze. Who would be visiting me? I hadn't received any visitors in days, not since this whole nightmare had started. My first instinct was to ignore it. I wasn't ready for any more interruptions, any more things from my past catching up to me. But the bell rang again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know who it could be, but I couldn't let whoever it was know that I was afraid. I walked to the door, trying to calm my breathing. I hesitated before opening it, wondering if it was the figure from the park, or if it was someone else, someone who had been watching me all along. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Only a small, unmarked envelope lying on the doorstep. I almost didn't want to touch it, but something inside me compelled me to. My hand shook as I picked it up, the paper cold and stiff between my fingers. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the corner. But the street was empty. Not a soul in sight. I brought the envelope inside and closed the door quickly behind me. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I carefully opened it. Inside was a single photograph, me, sitting on the park bench the night before. But it wasn't just a photo. The image was different, distorted somehow, as if someone had been editing it. There was something off about it. And then, scrawled in the corner of the photo, in dark red ink, were the words, "You're not alone." I stared at the message, my blood running cold. I didn't know what to think anymore. This was it. Whoever was doing this, whoever was behind all of this, they were playing with me. They were watching me. I slammed the photo down on the table and grabbed my phone. I needed help. But who could I turn to? No one would believe me. Everyone I knew would just think I was losing my mind, that I was overreacting. But as I looked at the photo again, my stomach dropped. There, just behind me in the shadows, was the faintest outline of a figure, barely visible, but there. Watching me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to disappear, to get as far away as possible from whatever this was. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, barely remembering to lock it behind me. I had to get away. But as I stepped into the hallway of the building, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the corridor, was a figure standing just outside the elevator. A person, or at least, what looked like one. My heart skipped a beat. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted down the stairs, not looking back. My footsteps echoed through the empty building, the sound somehow magnified by the silence surrounding me. I had to get to safety. I had to get away from this place. But when I burst through the front door and stepped out onto the street, I froze. There, standing on the opposite side of the road, was the same figure. The one from the park. The one in the photograph. The one that had been following me, silently, lurking in the shadows. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It was there, watching me, just like before. For a moment, it was like the world had stopped. The street was empty, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, the figure took a step forward. I took a step back. It moved again. Another step. Another. And then I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran. As fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't dare look behind me, but I knew that it was still there, following me. The footsteps, slow and measured, were just behind me. Always behind me. I ran and ran, my breath ragged, my chest burning. I didn't stop, not until I reached the edge of the city, where the streets grew quieter, emptier. But I knew, deep down, it wouldn't matter where I went. It wouldn't matter how far I ran. I wasn't getting away from it. I wasn't getting away from them. I was trapped. I collapsed in the dimly lit alley at the edge of the city, my lungs burning from the effort. My legs felt like jelly, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind only a hollow exhaustion. I leaned against the cool brick wall, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, but I couldn't stop moving. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, that haunting, unblinking presence that had followed me every step of the way. I wiped my brow, my mind racing as I tried to process everything that had happened. The letters, the photographs, the warning, "You're not alone." It had all escalated so quickly, turning my life into a waking nightmare. I thought I'd escaped, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. No matter how far I ran, it was always one step behind me. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the alley was empty. The city's noises, distant car horns, a barking dog, seemed muffled, like I was trapped in some strange limbo. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I flinched. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled it out, praying it wasn't another cryptic message. But the screen only showed a single new text. "Stay inside tonight." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. The message was simple, direct. The same warning as before, but it carried an undeniable weight, a sense of finality that I couldn't ignore. Who was sending this? Who knew where I was? It wasn't just a figure anymore. Whoever was behind all of this, they were watching me, controlling me, dictating my every move. I quickly typed out a reply, my hands shaking as I struggled to compose my thoughts. "Who is this?" The screen blinked for a moment, the message hanging in the air, waiting for a response. I held my breath, staring at the phone, praying for an answer. But it never came. Instead, the screen went black. I froze, staring at the lifeless device in my hand. Had it just died? Or had someone, something, cut me off? A soft noise from behind me made me spin around, my heart pounding in my chest. The alley was still empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was lingering just beyond my vision. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, before I heard it again, a faint rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. I snapped my head to the side. There, at the far end of the alley, the figure stood. It wasn't a person anymore. It was something more, a shape, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around it, bending the shadows in unnatural ways. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness like a dagger. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't move. My legs refused to work. It was like the air itself had thickened, wrapping me in its suffocating grip. The figure took a step forward, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, as if the world itself was reacting to its presence. Another step, and the air seemed to crackle with static, the hairs on my arms standing on end. And then, in a voice that was both distant and near, it spoke. "You've been chosen." The words echoed in my mind, a chill running down my spine. I had no idea what it meant. I had no idea what they wanted from me. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to survive this. Not unless I fought back. I forced my legs to move, forcing myself to run again, even as my body screamed in protest. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I had to. The sound of footsteps behind me, their rhythm now in perfect sync with my own, spurred me forward. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. The alley twisted, narrowing as I sprinted through it, the walls pressing in on me. I felt like I was running in circles, like the city itself had become a maze with no exit. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurring from exhaustion. I couldn't keep this up forever. I had to find a way to stop this. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, an uneven part of the pavement, and I stumbled, crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I heard the footsteps slow, drawing nearer, and then, nothing. Absolute silence. I lifted my head, panic flooding my chest. The figure was right there, just a few feet away. It stood still, as if waiting for me to get up. I scrambled to my feet, eyes darting around for an escape, but the alley was a dead end. There was nowhere to run. "You can't escape." The words came again, whispered like a breath against my ear, and I realized it was inside my head. It wasn't just following me physically. It was in my mind, controlling me, twisting my thoughts. I felt my knees go weak. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but I couldn't. It took another step forward, and then I heard something else. A sound, faint at first, like the flutter of paper. My eyes darted to the ground, and to my horror, I saw a letter floating on the wind toward me. I bent down slowly, dread filling my veins as I picked it up. The envelope was pristine, untouched by the grime of the alley. I stared at it, trembling. I opened it with shaking hands. "Don't resist. You can't fight it. You belong to us now." I looked up, and the figure was gone. But I could feel its presence lingering, the weight of its gaze still pressing on me. I was no longer just a victim. I was something more. I was part of this game, this trap. And now there was no escaping. There never had been. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.